thank you. This is a beautiful setting. It truly is. And I walked into this room and I said, maybe we should just not do the talk. Let's just do a book reading instead. There's some amazing volumes on the walls here. So thank you again for having me here. It's a privilege to be here. It's one of life's greatest mysteries as to why I haven't been in Dublin till today. This is my first time here. We spent, I guess we forgot to order the good weather. But then somebody told us that that's the way it is, and so we'll work with that. But what I thought I'd do today is to spend a little bit of time talking about the last mile, probably no more than a couple of minutes, and then I'll talk about some more recent developments in thinking since then. As Sean said, I work with the Privy Council Office in the Canadian federal government as part of an initiative called the Innovation Hub. The Innovation Hub is a unit of government that brings together people from the behavioral sciences, from the data sciences, and from design to try and see how best we can achieve policy innovation. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. I'll talk a little bit about sort of a framework for behavior change that we're developing both at the Innovation Hub and at BEAR, which is a center that we have at the University of Toronto. BEAR stands for Behavioral Economics in Action at the Rotman School. There's a little bear coming out of there. It's very Canadian. We work actively with the Canadian federal government as well. And then, if we have time towards the end, I'll talk through some examples of work that we've done in Canada and elsewhere, applying some of these ideas. Okay, let me start off by making three simple claims, hopefully not very controversial. Claim number one is that every organization I know of, by the way, this took me about 25 years to figure out, claim one, is in the business of changing behavior. I mean, there's nothing that I can think of that doesn't involve behavior change. And then in the book I talk a little bit about different forms of behavior change. These are the four most common categories of behavior change. There's compliance, the idea that a government wants you to follow regulations, wants you to file paperwork of a certain specification by a certain point in time, and you need to do that. Your regulatory departments have a compliance function as well. So a lot of behavior change kind of happens to be in the compliance domain. In business, we think a fair bit about switching or purchasing behaviors. You've got people buying your competitor's product, you want them to buy yours. You've got people eating chocolate cake for dessert, you want them to eat fruits and veggies instead, and so on and so forth. Consumption, another big category, either information or of physical substances. So for example, privacy commissioners are often interested in making sure that people consume information about the harm associated with posting information online. Your doctor wants you to understand the risks associated with medication and so on and so forth. But a big problem, for example, in Canada is the lack of adherence to medication regimes. So like a good South Asian, as you can tell from my looks, I was born in India, have been a Canadian for the past many years. But true to my heritage, I have cholesterol problems. It just comes with the birthplace, right? And so I'm on statins. I have to consume 20 mgs of statin medication every day. Every single pill that I consume doesn't make me feel any different. And this is true of diabetes medications, it's true of a large genre of medications. It's just that at some point in time, my likelihood of getting a heart attack and dying would go up if I don't take my medication. And so adherence to medication regimes turns out to be a massive problem in many parts of the world, right? And so we've been working with the Canadian government on sort of fixing that problem. How can we use behavioral interventions to make sure that people take their medication? And then finally, acceleration. This is our classic problem. All of us want to do things on time, but we never do it because life gets in the way, right? And so the whole acceleration behavior change is the idea that we want to get people to do things before it's too late. We want to get them to save for retirement. We want them to consume their medication. We want them to eat healthy and so on and so forth. And so that's claim number one. I'm not going to get into too much detail. In the book, I sort of talk about some research where I went in and interviewed a number of CEOs, CFOs, and COOs, and they all claim that this is one of their big challenges. Claim number 2, which again I'm not going to substantiate today, is that companies aren't very good at this stuff. In fact, they're dreadful at this stuff. In fact, if you ask CEOs or COOs or CMOs as to what's the one thing that keeps you up at night, they'll talk about behavior change. Right? They'll say, well, I have an innovation process, but I don't have a behavior change process. I know how to come up with new products. I don't know how to get people to use them, and so on and so forth. And the third claim that I'm going to make is again, like those of you who are in the behavioral science arena know this, but I'm going to make it anyway. And that has to do with why we have this fundamental problem with behavior change. Right? This is, I'm an academic, I have to show you equations, my apologies. But this is a picture that illustrates how the world thinks people make decisions. Right? This is actually a sheet from my economics notes from when I was a graduate student back at the University of Chicago. This one in particular is called the Cobb-Douglas utility function. I'm not going to go into what it is. If you don't know what it is, not to worry, I've forgotten myself what it is. But the point is, there is a belief in economics that human beings make decisions by optimizing something called utility. It's a value of goodness. It's a measure of how much intrinsic value a product or an option gives you. And the theory is simple. There's an equation that specifies how people get utility from products. So my utility from a glass of water is a function of how thirsty I am, and how cold the water is, and how much money I'm going to pay for it, and so on and so forth. And my decision to consume is going to be driven by this animal, U. And then sometimes in economics, we want people to make sort of these complex choices, which is how much water should I have versus how much of something else, and those are called allocation tasks, and we do those tasks by optimizing the combined utility from those two things. Right? So essentially, we write a function, we set the first differential to 0, and then we select that particular allocation such that the value arising from that first differential equals to 0 is the highest. Sounds simple. I can express fairly complex decisions on a single sheet of paper like this one. Problem is, I don't know anyone who actually does that. Right? So we think about a simple problem that economists have agonized over for years, which is how much should I save for my retirement? Right? There's a beautiful theory that explains it. It's a life cycle hypothesis. There's a behavioral equivalent of it called the behavioral life cycle hypothesis. And it says, well, it's simple. All you do is look forward, think about your entire consumption stream from now to when you're going to die, think about your entire income stream from now to when you're going to die, and set aside as much such that the net present value of the first is the same as the net present value of the second. I can write this in 3 equations, right? But just think about what I need to do to actually solve this problem. I need to figure out when I'm going to die, which I don't know. I need to know my income streams, which I don't know. For that, I need to know what inflation is going to look like, and whether we're going to have Trump or not, and Brexit or not. And these are all things we know nothing about. And even if we did, nobody can do the math required to do this. Right? So we're going to call these people, I'm going to use language that was first made popular by my PhD supervisor, Richard Taylor, econs. Right? These are fictitious people that only live on the pages of economics textbooks. That's where you find them. Econs are rational. They can compute at the speed of light. They are not emotional. They are not impulsive. They're forward-looking. They're amazing people. Econs get smarter every single year. Right? And the reason econs get smarter is the way the publishing function works in academia. Right? I can write a paper saying that let's consider an agent who is forward-looking. Right? And then Sean can come along and say, well, no, let's also look at an agent who is forward-looking and can compute quickly. And then somebody else says, well, no, not just those two things, but they should be able to anticipate what other people do. And so the only way in which you get published in economics is to come up with agents that become smarter with time. I'd make the argument that fewer people do the opposite. They're probably becoming dumber with time. So the gap between econs and real humans is increasing. You've probably seen this picture, which captures real people. And the idea is that real people are impulsive, they're short-sighted, they're emotional, they don't think a whole lot. They are driven by what other people do. So you can actually look at this picture and say, well, why are these two individuals in this photograph taking the escalator to go to the helpline? Right? I did ask this question to an economics colleague of mine who had a beautiful forward-looking explanation. He said, these people know that they're going to expend energy in the gym, so they're going to save it now. Right? Which in theory seems right, but somehow doesn't seem that that's what's going on. Or it could be that the person in the dark blue shirt saw the person in the light blue shirt take the escalator, they did the same thing. We now know that this sounds trite, but is true of much of human behavior. People do what other people do without caring for why those other people do what they do. Right? And that's an interesting principle, and we'll sort of get into that and how it can be used. But to me, it strikes me that I actually don't think these people were thinking at all. They probably came in from the right-hand side. The escalator was there. They stepped onto it. You could have put anything there. They probably would have stepped onto it, right? And a lot of human decision-making is like that. A lot of decisions people make are on autopilot. They're mindless. They're impulsive. So there's a big gap between econs and humans, and a lot of our problems in business and in government come about because we end up designing products and processes and systems for these people when in fact they're used by these people. We're working on a major project with the government of Mexico on the pension system. I don't know if anyone has any experience with the Mexican pension system. If you can do anything about it, try not to get any experience with the Mexican pension system. It is the most complicated pension system in the world, right? And so we try to understand exactly how it works and what people need to do to make, there's a mandatory contribution, and there's an escalating voluntary contribution, and then every 6 months the government issues an update to what they think you should be contributing to the voluntary part, and you could contribute to the voluntary part either online or at your local 7-Eleven or on your mobile phone, and it is so confusing that people choose not to contribute at all. And when we point this out to the system administrators, their first response is, well, but we told people what they needed to do. Right? And I think that's the fundamental gap between our expectations of what people do and what they actually do. And so that's what I call in my book a last mile problem. That we end up designing for econs, we should be designing for humans. We should be assuming when we design anything that our end users will forget to do stuff. We should assume that they will be impulsive. We should assume that they won't care for the information that you put out there for them to read, and so on. So I'll give you some examples of this as we go along. So that's a fundamental challenge. It's what we call the last mile problem, and it's something we're looking to fix. Now, before I get into examples, I'm just going to do a quick psychology 101. I'm sure everybody here knows this, but just for the sake of being on the same ground. In psychology, we talk about 4 issues that drive human behavior. Right? There is cognition. Do people know what they're going to do? Do they know how to do it? There is motivation, which is, do they have enough of a fuel or engine or desire to actually do it? That's an important issue. It's important because oftentimes we sort of try and help people by improving their cognition without actually caring about the motivation. Right? And you could make things cognitively as easy as you can for people, but if they don't care about the problem, they're not going to solve it. Right? And so that's an important one. Perception, how do people see the problem? Do they see it the same way as you do? And then find the emotion, how do they think about the problem? How do they feel about the problem? Right? And I'm going to list 3 simple sins that we often commit in organizations, governments in particular, but businesses as well. One is that we focus too much on the content of the thing that we're trying to solve. We focus too much on information. We focus too much on, oops, don't do that, and too little on the context. Right? And I'll give you an example of that in just about a minute or so. We focus too much on cognition, too little on all of the other issues. You talk to a government officer about any specific behavioral problem, their first reaction is, oh, people probably don't know. Right? We have this beautiful welfare product in Canada called the Canada Learning Bond. It's $2,000 of free money that you can use to educate your children if in fact you're below a certain income level. I distinctly remember this, 2011 was when the program was launched. The chief economist at that point in time said, who would not take up free $2,000? Right? It turns out 6 months after launching the program, the take-up rate was only 16%, 1/6. So 84% of people who were eligible for the benefit weren't taking it. Right? You know the government's response was, they probably don't know about it. Right? So we spent $1 million and $2 million and then $4 million to promote that Canada Learning Bond. That promotion pushed the take-up rate from 16 to 16.25%. What was it? Right? It wasn't an awareness problem. When you start actually spending time in the field, there were lots of behavioral frictions. There was simple sort of logistic friction, which is a lot of people who were eligible for this bond were people that were working 3 jobs and they were looking after 4 kids, and so they didn't have time to go to the bank to open the account that you needed before the bank shut at 6 p.m. Right? So there was clearly some sort of logistical issues, but they felt out of place in a bank. That was the biggest problem. Right? They don't want to go and talk to somebody in a suit because they felt like that person wouldn't understand their needs. They felt that if they went in to ask to open that particular account, that they would be embarrassed. That was the friction. It wasn't a cognitive friction at all. It was a motivational, it was a emotional friction. And so we designed for these people a little wallet card with a QR code that had all the information they needed on that QR code. So they would go to the bank, give the card over, the teller would simply scan it. There was no need for conversation. They would just open up an account and they were done. Right? And so by taking out that need for conversation, we were able to solve that last mile problem, and we did a few other things, including sort of a mobile bank that went to households to try and get them to open the account. But by doing these interventions, we were able to push the 16.25 to today about 59% in households. It wasn't about just lack of awareness, it was lots of other things, right? And then we focused so much on what users say and not what they do. Right? And I could spend the entire 2 hours talking about that bullet point, which is, I think we now know a lot from behavioral sciences that we probably shouldn't be trusting people when they tell you why they don't do what they don't do, because they oftentimes don't know. Right? A lot of times, decision making is so much dependent on the context that people aren't very sensitive to the contextual variable that drives their behavior. Okay, so those are the 3 sins. I'm also going to try and be audacious and try and break down, not break down, but summarize 350 years worth of psychology into one slide. Right? And the slide is that all of decision making is driven by 3 simple principles: context, the fact that you change context, people's behavior changes; procrastination, the idea that all of us want to be good human beings, we want to save more for retirement, we want to eat fruits and veggies, we want to spend more time with our families, but tomorrow, not today, because we're busy today. Right? So, I can relate to this. In 2007, I promised myself as a good Canadian that I would be fluent in both my national languages. I was pretty good at English, and I said, you know what, maybe I should be fluent in French as well. So I promised that I would sign up for classes. Right? Today, I still promise that I will sign up for classes. Intention hasn't changed, right? Life got in the way. There were children to be dropped off at practice, and household chores to be done, and books to be written, and so I never got around to doing that. And so oftentimes we spend a lot of time and energy and effort to convince people that they should do certain things, but in fact they don't need to be convinced. Right? So we're doing some work with the FCAC, which is the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. It's tasked with the objective of improving financial well-being and inclusion in Canada. That agency would spend a lot of their energy in financial education. Right? Let's educate people. Let's tell them what the right amount of savings should be, and so on and so forth. And over the last 3 or 4 years that we've been working with them, we've got them to change their focus from education to facilitation. Can we actually help people make the right choice? Can we actually facilitate behavior? And so that's the second thing, procrastination. And then inertia, the idea that unless you push people to make a choice, they will not make a choice. Right? I'll give you a quick example of that. In all of North America, and I'm assuming here as well, September and October are flu season. Everybody comes down with the flu, right? And the public health agency's primary weapon to combat flu is the so-called flu vaccination, the flu shot, right? And so the government spends a lot of time and energy making flu shots easily accessible and free to anyone that chooses to use them. Under those circumstances, about 47% of Canada's population gets their flu shot. So what can we do to get that number up, right? And so I'll give an example of what happens at the university. And the reason I'm going to give you that example is we did a study in the context of the university where I get an email every September saying, you know, Dilip, flu season is here. They'll talk about the different strains of the flu and they'll say, come to the atrium at any point in time next week to get your free flu shot. Right? So we kept track of what happened at the university. About 47% of people, like the Canadian national average, got their flu shot. Second version of the same email, right? We changed the subject line. It said, will you get your free flu shot next week? Question mark. Right? Same information, and at the end of the email it said, well, will you get your free flu shot next week? Yes or no? Rhetoric question, you don't have to write back. But simply by asking that question, we pushed that 47% to now 61%. Right? Why? Because you now asked me to make a decision. Right? Third version of the same email, same question in the subject line, same information, but instead of yes or no, we said yes because I care about my health and the health of my family versus no, I don't care. Right? 83%. Okay? Simple stuff. What we've really done here is rather than presenting a package of information as simply information, we've now forced, nudged people, we've prodded people to make a choice. And it turns out just by getting people to make a choice, they are much more likely to comply and follow through. The best practical tip, I actually got an award for this from an institute in Canada. It said, your book is great, but the most practical piece of advice from the book is how do you get responses to email? Right? Most of us send out email to which we get nothing, we hear nothing back. And my prescription is put a question in the subject line. You get a response. It may not be the one you like, but you'll get one. Right? So again, the idea is simple. By asking a question, you now put people in a decision mindset as opposed to an information mindset. Right? So that's an example of how we think through inertia. Okay. This is page 1 out of 17 of Instagram's privacy policy. Right? The reason I show you this is about 4 years ago, I'm trying to remember when Instagram came out, I think it was 4 years ago. I was in the living room, my son at that point in time was on his tablet computer doing this. Right? And I said, Neil, what are you doing? And he says, well, I've just downloaded this like really cool new thing, and this is all the stuff I need to agree to before I can use it. Right? So I thought I would spend some time trying to understand what that stuff was. So I spoke to Instagram, and I tried to get a sense of how much effort had gone into designing this particular document. By the way, this is a great document. Right? As far as privacy policies go, this is an amazingly well-crafted document. Instagram had a team of 26 lawyers and legal assistants who had worked for the best of 6 months to craft a document that my son was going to do this to. Right? And interestingly, with privacy documents, so the moment you say, I agree, it never comes back. You don't have to see it ever again. Right? And from a behavioral perspective, that's the worst time to deliver a privacy document. Right? Impatience. I've just downloaded this thing, I've heard about it from my friends, I want to play it, and now you make me read the 17 pages. Right? So we said, well, look, could you actually deliver this information at a different time? So we're now working on a project with the Privacy Commissioner's Office where we said, well, how about if you allow people to play a game or use an app for the first time without accessing any of the privacy documents. Right? Maybe a very simplified version. And then on the second time that they start the same app, that's when the full thing pops up. Right? And our early research shows that people are indeed much more likely to read and consume that information and make better choices as long as you don't make them read that information just after they downloaded the game. Right? What's happened here is context. Right? You've changed the context in terms of timing. Context changes construal. Context changes the way in which two parties from the opposite sides of the last mile view the same object. Right? To this team of 26 lawyers, this document was something that was designed to help my son and people like him, doing stupid things like posting information that he would later regret. To my son, that same object was a thing he had to agree to before he could use the program. Right? Simple change in timing fixes that problem. Here's another one. This is an example of, I think, the favorite study I've ever done. It's in the domain of coffee. I love coffee. And I was sitting in my office back in 2008. I was on a sabbatical from the university. I had nothing to do. Those of you in academia know exactly what that means, like nothing to do. And so I figured I would try and solve a puzzle that had been bothering me for many, many years, which was, in every coffee shop in the world, what's the distribution of sales between small, medium, and large cups? I don't like, this doesn't sound like much of a puzzle, but to an academic, it's like a big thing. So I spent a few months calling up hundreds of coffee shops all over the world, like hundreds, right? And I collected lots of data. I found out lots of interesting things. The first thing I found out was about 80% of all coffee shops all over the world sold coffee in 3 sizes. Right? Starbucks was the exception. They had 4. So that was one. The second thing I learned was about 70% of the world's coffee sales sold at coffee shops were in the medium cup. But then there's an interesting thing, right? There's absolutely no consistency in terms of how much coffee is in the medium cup of coffee. Not just across the world, but even in the same city. Right? So Toronto, we have 4 major coffee chains. One has 11 ounces in the medium cup, one has 10, one has 7.5, and one has 12.5. Right? And so I tried to sort of follow some people around, and interestingly, they kept drinking medium. It didn't matter how much coffee was in the medium, right? So we did this experiment actually in Hong Kong. This was done in a coffee shop, which was in the atrium of a large office building, which meant the same clientele was, kept coming back. 8 ounces, 10 ounces, and 12 ounces. People picked the medium size. I stopped them and I asked them why they chose that size. It was kind of like talking to Goldilocks, right? They'd say, well, the little one is too little, and the big one is too much, or some variation of that, right? And so I faithfully wrote down everything they said, thanked them. After 4 weeks, we got rid of the smallest size and added an even larger one. Not just 8, 10, and 12, we made it 10, 12, and 14. The new medium became the more popular size, the most popular size. 70% of people picked the new medium. I stopped them and asked them why. At least a dozen stopped me and said, well, didn't you just ask me that last month? And I said, yes, but humor me. And they said the same exact thing. The little one is too little and the big one is too much, right? And there are a couple of things that jump out here in the story. One is the idea that context changed preference. That itself is not a huge surprise. We know that, right? But the fact that people had no clue that context changed their preference was scary, right? And now we've done studies like this in a number of different domains where you can change certain things in the context and people's preferences shift dramatically. But those people have just absolutely no idea that the context had anything to do with it, right? And I can tell you this based on personal experience. I took this picture back in 2010 when Petro Canada, which is the leading gas station petrol pump in Canada, started selling octane 94. I wasn't quite sure why, because I'm an engineer by training. My first job actually was in engineering, designing car engines. And I remember from back then that there was no car that actually needs octane 94, right? So I took this picture, I ran home, I told my wife about it, she did the right thing, which is reminded me of my age, and said that was a long time ago, which it was. So I called a colleague of mine who confirmed that no car actually needs octane. Octane 94, right? And so I said, why is Petro-Canada selling us things that we don't need, right? And I still don't know why Petro-Canada is selling us things that we don't need. But I do know that the sales of 91 went up dramatically after they introduced 94. Like dramatically, it was like a 11, 12% increase in the sales of 91, right? And so what essentially happened was, we look at 87, 89, and 91. 89 was the most popular octane ranking that was purchased at Petro-Canada. The moment you added 94, 91 became the most popular, right? So in the language of behavioral economics, we call this a decoy product, right? Nobody actually buys 94. I heard a story from the United States that people actually tried to buy a 94 at a Shell gas station in Connecticut, but they had none of it to sell. They just kind of like had a button. And so there was a big lawsuit about that, and I'm not quite sure what happened. But the point is, nobody ended up actually buying 94. 94's job was simply to make 91 look good, right? Now it turns out that you can use this piece of insight in a fairly insidious way, just like Petro-Canada did, to get people to buy things they don't need. But you could also use it to get people to do good stuff, right? So we've actually used interventions like this to get people to choose the right health plan or the right vaccination bundle and so on and so forth, simply by making it the compromise option in an assortment of three, right? So that's another example of a context effect, right? I'm actually going to skip this one because I'm pretty sure most people know about this, and let me talk about Clocky, the alarm clock, and then we'll talk about some examples. Has anyone seen this? Okay, the alarm clock on wheels. Okay. I decided at some point in time that I was going to wake up at 6 a.m. every day. I have no memory of why I decided that. I think I just read that people who wake up early in the morning are successful and happy, and it kind of seemed like a good thing to do. So I invested in a good alarm clock, and I would set the alarm clock at 10:30 every night. I'd go to bed. I'd set the alarm for 6 a.m. right, and go to sleep. And at 6 a.m. there was a different me in my head. Right? And that different me would curse the 10:30 p.m. version of me and hit the snooze button. Right? Now, I don't know if anyone of you know this, but if you have any alarm clock that's plugged to an electric outlet and you snooze 9 times in succession, the clock gives up on you. The fact that I know this is disturbing. Right? But anyway, so I tried all these different things to get up at 6 a.m. and none of them worked. And then I found Clock. Right? So Clocky basically is on wheels. There's now a version of Clocky called Talkie, which you can pre-program with the most annoying sound that you find personally annoying. It escalates in pitch over time. It lets you hit the snooze button once and only once. The second time you try and hit it, it runs away from you. And it actually looks for places to hide underneath. You see a little panel there that's a sensor, which in my case would be the geometric center of a king-size bed, and it wails away. And the idea is, by the time you find Clocky and silence him, you are so awake that there is no way you will go back to sleep. Right? Now, in essence, what we've done here is we say, well, look, in the human head, there are 2 entities. There's a planner. There's the guy who tells you to eat fruits and veggies and get your flu shots and save for retirement. And then there's a doer who blows off the planner and does what he or she feels like doing, right? And Clocky, or things like Clocky, allow the planner to exert control over the doer, right? By essentially putting some sort of a contract in place. Right? In this case, the contract is a nuisance contract, right? If you don't shut the damn thing, this happened to me once. My neighbor woke up, my children woke up. The fire department almost came to my house because there was this massive sound. I was fast asleep. Bad things happen if you don't wake up, right? So it's essentially the planner in you tricks the doer into doing what the planner wants to do, right? Now, this is a fun product, but we've all seen products like this that have successfully gotten people to do things that they want to do, right? So, for example, Shlomo Bananzi and Richard Taylor had a savings product, a pre-commitment product called Save More Tomorrow, right? The idea was that you committed to saving more in the future, not today, right? Which people are happy to do. By the time future comes through, they've forgotten about their commitment, they've auto-enrolled themselves into a savings program, and it turns out that Save More Tomorrow participants actually saved more than people who had some really good wealth advisors and some absolutely fabulous advice and so on and so forth, because people pre-committed and they were locked into their behavior through simple psychology. Right? There's a number of different ways in which you can lock people into behavior. Right? So principle number one, everybody has good intentions, right? As long as that behavior is in the future. So success factor number one, get people to commit to doing good stuff in the future. They'll say yes. Right? Like nobody I know doesn't want to be a better person in the future. Right? So get them to say that they'll do it and then impose a lock. Right? So this is a technological lock. We have a psychological lock like Save More Tomorrow, which is people forget. Right? But I had a bunch of former students who developed a product called K-Safe. It's a cookie jar with a timer mechanism on it. Right? So that way you can save your fatty foods or your nachos or your cookies or whatever else, even your smartphones, put it in the cookie jar, put the timer on, and the damn thing doesn't open till time passes. Right? I mean, so how often has it been that we say, I don't want to check my phone for the next 3 hours, but if it beeps, you're going to check it. Right? None of it's in K-Safe, because you can't access it. Doesn't matter. The only way you can access your phone is to wait for time to pass, right? So that's a literal lock on your behavior, right? There's also other forms of locks. So Dean Carlin, who's a good friend of mine and an economist who was at Yale, now at Northwestern, invented a website called stick.com. It's stick with an extra K, S-T-I-C-K-K, right? It's a pre-commitment website for people who want to, accomplish any goal, anything like waking up at 6 in the morning. Stick uses two kinds of locks. The first lock it uses is a social lock. Right? So I could want to stick and say, I want to wake up at 6 a.m. Stick is going to ask me for my Twitter handle and my Facebook login and my LinkedIn login and so on and so forth. And if I fail to accomplish whatever I do, then all of my social and business networks will know with the hashtag fail that they will try to wake up at 6 and fail. Right? And they find that that works for many self-control problems. Right? The other kind of lock they use is a monetary lock. And this is a particularly interesting one. So they'll ask me, Dilip, how much is it worth to you to wake up at 6 a.m. every morning? I'm going to say $500. It's going to take the money from me. Right? And if I fail, it's going to donate the money to a charity not of my choice, but to something that it believes I would be completely and utterly opposed to. Right? So for example, last year I got threatened with the Trump campaign, right? Or the National Rifle Association, or something along those lines, right? And it turns out that people's motivation to not let their money go to them is so high that they wake up at 6 a.m. Right? So that's a simple sort of narrative on how we can actually use the principle of procrastination to help people make better choices. Okay, so what does all of this mean for behavior change? All right? I'm going to say, well, there's 4 pieces to the behavior change. First of all, this is where my talk gets utterly boring when we talk about frameworks. All right? Let's think about the following simple story. You go to a bar, the bartender says, I've got a behavior change puzzle for you, but all these people drinking beer A, and I want them to switch to beer B. What do I do? Right? And so you're with a lawyer, an economist, and an advertising person, and a behavioral scientist. The lawyer goes first and says, well, that's simple. Let's just make A illegal. Let's ban A. And now governments do this, right? They'll basically say, if I want to get people to switch from this to this, let's just make this illegal, right? Let's pass a law. Let's think about a ban. People don't like bans. Right? People hate bans, in fact. People feel like their freedom of choice is being imposed on. We all know what happened to Mayor Bloomberg and the famous soda ban back from 2011. Even today in New York, when the name Bloomberg comes up, the first reference that the average person says, oh, the guy who tried to ban my Coca-Cola. Right? It never got passed into law. But again, companies do this a lot, right? So iPhone, when they launch iPhone X, will withdraw iPhone X-1. in the marketplace. You got to buy the new stuff, right? So that's one approach. There is the information approach. Well, let's tell people about the benefits of the new product or the new choice, right? And again, it turns out that we're now learning from psychology that too much information isn't good. People don't consume it. They choose to ignore information beyond a certain limit. And so you can give people information, but that's not a strategy that works well all the time. Incentives, carrots and sticks. You could give people some sort of an incentive, you could give them a discount, you could give them a gift, you could give them some sort of a reward, or conversely you could penalize the behavior that you want to discourage. You could tax it, you could impose a surcharge. And again, there's a nice new meta-analysis in the area of health incentives, which shows that incentives are great in the short run, but the moment you withdraw them, people go back to what they do. Right? And then finally, you have a choice architect who says, look, listen, I understand how context affects choice. Could I change the context to steer people towards a certain choice? So the choice architect would offer you beer B as the default and say, well, look, if you want A, I can bring it out for you. Right? And it turns out default effects are particularly interesting. I'm sure a lot of people have written about this and spoken to you about this. Defaults work wonderfully well. I mean, they work well for two reasons. One is because people are cognitively and physically lazy, right? But also because people look at a default as a social norm, right? If the default in my country is that everybody's donating organs, for example, maybe that's the right thing to do, right? Everybody is donating organs, maybe so should I, right? So we've actually used the default idea in a number of different ways to get people to do things that are good for them. One recent example was from the United States. Worked with an insurance company that sold a health insurance product that entitled you to a prescription plan and your vaccinations and all that stuff, plus an annual checkup. Right? Now it turns out that we all know that getting seen by a doctor once in a year is great for the healthcare system, it is great for your own health, yet most of us don't get a checkup. Right? So in this particular community where we're doing the study, only about 17%, 17% of people who had bought a health plan that entitled them to an annual checkup actually got their checkup. Right? We asked these people why they didn't go there, the 83% why they didn't get their checkup, and the most common response was that too busy, don't have the time. Right? Me being me, didn't trust them, created a second version of the plan where, let's say, Sean, you bought a product from me. You would get a phone call saying, Sean, thank you for signing up for our product. I've taken the liberty of booking you an appointment for June the 16th at 10 a.m. Should you not be able to make it, give us a call. Right? So randomly assigned, half people got that, the other half got the traditional form. 17 or 18% people in the control condition actually got their health checkups. 67% of people who were randomly assigned an appointment saw their doctor. They were not busy at all. They just didn't want to call. Right? And we've actually I work with a lot of companies and I jokingly tell people the best way to get your employees to do anything is to default them into it and have them call HR to opt out. Right? Nobody likes talking to HR departments for various reasons. Right? We've got people to sign up for a Big Brothers and Big Sisters volunteer program where they spend 4 hours on a Sunday morning away from their families with juvenile delinquents. Right? Because that was the default. Right? And obviously this was done through ethics approval and all kinds of things, right, in the interest of science. But the point is, people are just incredibly lazy. They try to go with the default as best as they can, unless you make the default option so terribly bad that they will try not to. Okay? So the reason I point out these 4 approaches to behavior change is not because I think any one of them is better than the other, but we need to. It's a handy kind of way to think about different approaches to behavior change. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. The incentives work well in the short run. Choice architecture, likewise, a really good short-run strategy, but much more inexpensive compared to incentives. But information might be a nicer, longer-term strategy, and as well, restrictions could work well in the long run. after you've demonstrated early success. So I think we need to think about all of these as a basket of approaches rather than one versus the other when we think about the behavior change puzzle. I always think about behavior change as a plumbing problem, right? Where you want to get people from the left-hand side of this picture to the right-hand side, psychologically from state A to state B, but along the way, there are many discrete things that we want them to do differently. Right? Oftentimes, the big challenge I see within governments in particular, and sometimes within companies, if you try and do too much at once, right? The government, for example, would say, well, we'd like households to consume less energy. So that's great, right? But there's a lot of little things that means, right? I can consume less energy by using all my appliances less. I can consume less energy by getting rid of some appliances. I can do it by upgrading to energy efficient appliances. There are just many different things that I can do to go through that entire pipeline. Likewise, when we talk about improving customer attitude, that sounds great, right? But again, there's lots of little discrete things that need to be done for that final outcome to happen. And so the reason I call it a plumbing problem is I say, well, in order to get people from one point to the other point, there are lots of little lengths in that pipeline that we need to think about. In what sequence and how are we going to structure that behavior change process. And then we just need to make sure that the pipes are clean. If the pipes are clean, liquid will flow through them, right? And if there's a pressure differential across the two, what does that mean? If people are motivated to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, right? And so rather than trying to tackle a big behavior change problem, our approach is simple. We say, well, let's actually break it down into very specific behaviors. Each one of them can be measured with a yes, no, or an A versus B, or a success or failure, and then set it up as a series of sequential problems that we can then solve one at a time. The best approach for each of these sections of the pipeline might be different. So in one case, it might be an incentive, and the other case, it might be a choice architecture intervention, or it could be something else. So, that's a slightly more detailed version of that same exact thing. Okay? Let me just maybe toss out a couple of examples, and then I'll shut up and maybe take questions. Here's some work we did for the province of Ontario on trying to get people to renew their motor vehicle licenses. These are your, actually, not the driver's license, but your vehicle license, online rather than going in person to a center. Right? And I show you two pictures. On the top is the standard letter one would get when it was time to renew your license. If it is difficult to read, it is because it is difficult to read. That's the way it was. Right? It said, click, print, drive, renew online and receive a 10-day extension. Right? And when you looked at that message, it basically, there were a couple of things. One is it got hidden in that general layout of gray and black and white. Right? And so just putting a blue stripe through it made that particular part of the message a bit more salient. But second, it was, it's similar to me that if you're late, then you should file online because then you get an extension. Right? But if you're on time, you don't need to do that. Right? So there was sort of the way the language was structured, people inferred something that it wasn't supposed to say. And so we changed that language at the bottom, which said click, print, and drive, instant and easy renewal online at that particular URL. A bunch of other changes within the form. Again, on the top, your letter, which said left it to the last minute, no problem. At the bottom, discover the convenience of renewing online. We did the standard gain frame, loss frame, in this case, why go online versus why not go online, and so on and so forth. And we were actually able to show that essentially these two simple changes, which is highlighting the information on the cover and focusing the message on the benefits of going online versus the last minute message, increase the take-up rates significantly. Only about 23% of people who were renewing online before a randomized controlled trial that we did, now about 74% are renewing online through these simple behavior interventions. Here's another one, organ donations. Right? On the left, the province of Ontario form for organ donations. Apparently it hadn't been updated since 1956. Right? And people asked, I asked for it to be updated. They said, no, we need 22 approvals to update the form. Right? And so I kind of said, have any forms ever been changed in the government? And they said, no. And I said, that can't be true, right? And so I found this person who ran the form section of the ministry, and he said, no, we actually had like 7 forms that changed. And I said, like, why did they change? Well, it doesn't that they changed because the printing contractor who actually printed out government forms ran out of the specific color ink. Right? So it turns out the printing contractor runs out of ink. You don't need 22 approvals. It's interesting, right? So I worked with the contractor. I said, you know what? Can you just print this out on smaller paper for us? Right? Just like, print it on a day in which you don't have a stock, the large legal size paper. And so they printed a smaller version of the forms. The forms showed up. I offered to pay for them. I said, you know what, like, I'll pay for these forms. But the government doesn't like waste as well. So they said, no, let's not waste the forms. And so we did a couple of things. On the left-hand side, the old form used to be handed to you at the motor vehicles licensing center after you finish renewing your driver's license. Right? Average wait time 20 minutes. You waited there. You got your form renewed. Now somebody says, would you like to be an organ donor? Right? Most people never know. Right? Or they take the form and they go away, never to come back, simply because it looks long and intimidating. It's not that long. Right? So we shorten the form on the right-hand side. It's now on card. It is handed to people as they enter the center, as opposed to when they leave the center. Right? And it's printed on card instead of paper, so that when you're standing in line and filling it up, your ballpoint pen doesn't actually go through the paper, right? So we did that. I'm not going to go through all the details of the trial that we did, but essentially here are the results. Interestingly, bottom right, 143% increase in organ and tissue donor registrations. 143% increase. That's a big increase, simply by making the process simple and effective. 2.5 minutes saved per organ and tissue transaction. The agents in the service center also like this intervention, simply because they didn't take as long on the intervention. And top left, we spent $2,700. That's it on the intervention. That was it, right? Out of which $1,200 was a one-time cost of renewing the form, right? And it turns out that the ROI on some of these interventions is absolutely stunning. Okay? Let me show you one last one, and then I'll take questions. Buying fruits and veggies. The United States Department of Agriculture had a famous campaign called the 50-50 campaign. It said, half of everything you eat should be fruits and veggies, the other half can be whatever you want. Right? And there was a ad campaign that ran between 2007 and 2011. It was a beautiful ad campaign. It was memorable. People loved it. They understood it. They just weren't eating 50-50. Right? And the reason they weren't eating 50-50 is that they weren't buying 50-50. Right? When you think about it, it's easy to see why that's the case, right? Is when people shop in a grocery store, they're not making an allocation decision. They're simply buying one item at a time. Right? And so we said, what can we do as an in-store intervention to try and cue people to this idea of 50-50? Here's what we did. It was a shopping cart with the sheet of paper at the bottom, half of which was red, and the other half was green. Right? And that was it. It was essentially a visual cue, but it also made the notion of shopping as an allocation task more salient. So now people will say, well, gee, I bought meat, maybe I should compensate by buying a fruit or a vegetable. And so we did a trial. I have to say this series of trials wasn't as clean as some of the other ones we've done. But in a few of our experiments, we got significant increases in the consumption or the purchase of fruits and veggies as compared to the control condition when there was no MAT. Okay, so last slide. Okay, what does all of this mean for governments, for organizations, for anybody looking to make evidence-based behavior decisions, right? Data is not the same as evidence, right? Data tells us what happened. Evidence tells us why that thing happened, right? I have a colleague called Adi Goldfarb, both at Bayer and at the federal government, and he says that you can never learn anything about human behavior by launching just one version of an intervention, right? Governments do this all the time. They launch a new program, they do something called an assessment or an evaluation of the program by simply comparing what the world looked like before the program versus what the world looks like after the program, right? And again, as scientists, we know that that doesn't tell us a whole lot. It tells us that the world changed, but we don't know if it changed because of the program, but it changed because the world changed, right? And so unless we have evidence which is of the nature of a control condition versus a treatment condition, where you run two conditions simultaneously, we'll never really learn as to why a particular behavior change happened, right? The other principle is evidence now and here is not the same as evidence then and there, right? As we know, a lot of decision making is so context dependent that oftentimes you run something in a context, the interventions work beautifully, you run the same intervention in a different context, and it just stops working. Therefore, especially as an applied scientist, critically important to keep testing every single intervention, no matter how successful they have been elsewhere, right? So I showed you the example of the benefits of discovering, the convenience of online renewal. We had a loss frame of that, and we know from several years of research by Kahneman University that loss frames impact behavior change significantly more strongly than gain frames, right? Guess what? We found the opposite, right? And consistently we found the opposite. When you're trying to get people to think about a new way or a new medium. Maybe it's a Canadian thing. Maybe Canadians don't like the losses, right? And we still don't know what it is. But it was only because we tested that we were able to come to the conclusion that the gains versus loss framing doesn't work the same way as we thought it would, right? Couple of other things, imperfect experiments are better than none. That's okay, right? It's okay to have some sort of an experiment rather than unless, of course, your experiment is systematically bad, in which case you're probably better off not doing an experiment at all, right? So in sum, right, nudging turns out can be a very powerful way of changing behavior, choice architecture, especially when used in conjunction with our traditional approaches to behavior change, as a plumbing problem, and then finally experimentation. Without experimentation, there is no behavioral science. Right? So maybe there I'll pause and open it up to questions, comments, discussions, absolutely anything I can talk about.